I'd like to give a brief content warning before I start this episode. The film I'm going to discuss today will involve me having to discuss sexual violence, so I will have to mention it throughout the episode. If that's not something you feel like you can listen to right now, then I won't blame you if you skip this episode. Hello, my name is Amber, and this is You Look Like a Badger, a podcast where I discuss queer cinema. It is officially Halloween. This episode should be going up on Halloween, and I'm very excited this year. Literally only about watching scary movies and literally nothing else in my life. So it's all been a bit much. A lot has happened, and in a lot of ways nothing has happened. But the world is feeling weirder and weirder, so I come to relax by talking about movies to you, and you listen, hopefully to also relax. So this year, season 4 of the podcast, I've decided to cover some of the worst rated LGBT movies according to, I think I got this list from Letterboxd. It's been interesting. I've had a lot of varying opinions. Apart from maybe the first episode where I was really mean, I think I managed to find quite a bit of substance to the movies that I watched. Yeah, I watched Lesbian Vampire Killers, I watched GBF, I watched The Roommate, and I watched another gay movie. Now, apart from the first one, none of these movies, to me, have been especially egregious. I haven't had a aggressively negative opinion. And with this episode, I am doing another vampire movie. And not only am I doing another vampire movie, this potentially might be the favourite of this season, as in, the more I watch this movie, the more affection I've grown for it. Prepare to be frustrated with my opinions about this wonderful piece of trash. Before I get into that, I'm going to do a sneaky plug just before we start. I released a poetry collection at the end of September. It's called My Mother Called Me a Hermit, and I worked very hard on it. I'm very proud of it. I created a collection of stuff to enjoy. So you could buy the collection, and that would be very nice for me. I'd really appreciate that, actually. There are 3 of the poems from the collection on my website. I've also created a playlist. I created a watch list to go along with the collection. I also wrote a foreword on my website. It's a whole bundle. You can go. You should go and check that stuff out. I'd be really grateful if you did. This episode is not about that, because we are diving into the depths of sexual frustration and shame, and a member of Spandau Ballet writhing around in pain on the floor. This movie that we're covering today is Embrace of the Vampire.
You dreamt about it. You've never seen it before, but you've dreamt about it.
Yeah, I know it sounds weird.
What kind of dream?
It was,
What?
a man was wearing it.
Not Chris?
No, not Chris.
Who?
You'll laugh.
No, I won't. You know me. I have weird dreams all the time.
I think he was a vampire.
A vampire. Cool. And you had sex with him?
No, but I think he wanted to.
Embrace of the Vampire is a 1995 erotic horror starring Alyssa Milano and Martin Kemp, and was directed by Anne Gossard. Charlotte is attending a new school and dealing with the pressures typical of teenagers, with one small twist. There is a vampire who insists she is his long-lost love, and he begins tearing through her life to get to her. Like many vampire stories, it deals with desire and religion combined, once more codifying the creature of the night as the buried desires of its main character. All of this is told with the trashy veneer of straight-to-video erotica popular in the 90s, and its blunt crassness only really makes it shine for me. Now, you won't be surprised to learn that this did not win any awards, mainly because it was the type of movie to be churned out very quickly to cash in on this craze of erotic thrillers that were lining the shelves of video rental stores. It also does not have a critic score on Rotten Tomatoes, but it does have an audience score, and that audience score is 26%. And on Letterboxd, it has a 2.2. Am I at all going to argue that this film is something that you have to like? No. What I am going to say is that the more research that I've done about the specific aesthetics of erotic thrillers and softcore videos and the vampire craze that was going on around this time, the combination of trying to get something out that was substantive enough to have a story there, but shallow enough that it wouldn't interrupt the people who were simply watching it, to create a mood, so to speak. Looking at it within its context makes it more interesting to me. Like I said, I've grown more and more fond of it the more I've had to write about it and read more about it. Am I going to say that it's excellent? No. But I do love watching it. I love sitting down to watch it. I've watched it 3 times total, twice this year, and each time it's gotten better for me. So I'm going to read some reviews, which for the most part weren't especially kind. They're going to be nowhere near as kind as I ended up being. The first review is by user Anna Tude, who says, if you're looking for boobs, this is the movie for you. I don't know if I'm just desensitized or in the process of researching this, I watched a lot of films in a similar vein where there was just more nudity, but there isn't that much in this movie. There's definitely some, but there's not that much. These types of films orient themselves around erotic set pieces and sex scenes, which tend to be at the forefront. Like I said, if you know what you're getting into, then you're not going to be shocked by the experience, but I can understand someone being like, I want to watch a vampire film and this feels a little bit pornographic, which is kind of the intent, but each to their own. I think people should be more naked in movies. Being naked is cool, and there has to be different ways to show it. We're in a phase of, especially in horror, where the body of naked old women is a source of terror and fear. Not enough really is done to destigmatize nudity. I think American culture in particular is still very puritanical. It's only really getting more so. And don't get me wrong, the British are absolutely worse. What I am saying is this attitude towards sex and nudity on screen, it feels very cultural. The next review is by Emily Rugburn, who says, tall British photographer girl who smokes cloves and wears Converse and makes the first move, I'd be defenseless. Now, what you need to know about Sarah is that she is not a particularly complex character, but the second that she is on screen, she does kind of emanate a bisexuality or sexual fluidity, and there is something very interesting that I will probably talk about later about the confidence that she imparts onto the main character. What you also need to know is that all of her dialogue seems to be ADR'd. There are definitely certain parts where it doesn't seem to sync up, so I'm not sure if the actress wasn't actually British and she'd been dubbed over, or there was just some issues with her scenes, but it looks really weird and kind of bad. I still find her fascinating as a character, and I kind of agree. All of those things kind of check the boxes for attractiveness. And this last review, I got a snippet out of this one because it was quite long. Heather Santraus, who says, not much of a story, not much of a romance, and hardly any horror to be found. Not much of a story. I'd agree there. It's pretty by the books, and if you've seen vampire movies before, you do kind of know where it's going to go. From Nosferatu to Twilight even, there is this idea that being stalked by a vampire is kind of a turn on, but it's also very, very scary. So where I disagree that there's no horror in the film, I think the horror of sexual shame is incredibly pervasive throughout. Something doesn't have to shake you to your core to be a horror film. It doesn't have to scare you personally to be invoking horror tropes or ideas of abject terror, which is simply being confronted by the fact that you're a sexual person who really doesn't want to be a sexual person because the idea of sex brings a lot of shame, and having to work through those ideas is really, really scary, and that kind of manifests as a vampire sneaking into your room and trying to bite you. Am I the leading expert on Embrace of the Vampire? Potentially. I'm probably one of its 2 defenders. I have a lot to say about it. But first, I'm going to give you a spoiler warning because now I have to talk about the film in detail, and I think you should watch it. I genuinely mean this. It's a fun enough time that even if you think it's genuinely bad, that you will probably have a good time watching it. The last I checked, it was on Tubi. You could probably find it somewhere else, somewhere sneaky. If you wanted to watch it, go watch it, then come back and listen to me mount a spirited defense of this sexy little vampire movie.
After centuries, having drank blood enough to fill 1,000 lakes, in this place, this small college, I have found her soul again. I have found her. But my time in this world is coming to an end. In 3 days I will fall into eternal sleep. Only her soul can save me. My virgin, my elixir. But she loves another. I will put doubt in their minds. Then I will take her when her heart is not his. Eternal life will be her prize. 3 days. But I can't just reach out and take her. She must desire me before I empty her life into my throat and take back the love I lost so long ago.
I feel like I haven't done a history lesson in a while, mainly because I'm not good at them and I'm not fond of dumping a bunch of history on you, because one, I'm always concerned that I haven't done enough research and I'm getting something wrong and my sources are bad, or I mistakenly phrase something in a certain way that makes me seem stupid. That's my insecurities showing. What I think is important to understand, I suppose, why I like this movie, but also why this movie exists, what brought it to this place, and what different forces are being enacted on it to make it kind of immune to being seen as objectively good. So there are what I'd say 4 separate aspects shining down on a piece of work like this. The first point is the bodice ripper, or erotica for women, and how this has kind of influenced the way women interact with romance or even pornographic material, but also how it is perceived culturally. Because I think there is this idea that women, A, don't have any kind of outward sexuality, B, what they enjoy is bad and frivolous, and C, they need to be protected from consuming problematic material that includes taboo or dark themes, for fear that they will internalize them and be perpetrators in their own victimization. So the bodice ripper specifically is a complicated and controversial term. It is specifically a novel, but I think it does become its own kind of genre where a disempowered woman is pursued by a man much more powerful than her, and this will often include scenes of what would be called dubious consent or consensual non-consent, where sexual violence is eroticized and a kind of rape fantasy is played out. So I found an article written by Michaela Marini Higgs which said this: bodice rippers describe a short and specific moment in American publishing history that lasted only between the early 1970s and the mid-1980s. Replacing shorter and serialized novels with more sexually explicit books inspired the popularity of The Flame and the Flower, released in 1972. Bodice rippers met reader demand and flooded the market with mass-produced romances. Representing some of the problematic politics of the 1970s, rape is a major plot device in many bodice rippers, meaning that in most cases, the ripping and removal of clothing isn't consensual. So we see this in Embrace of the Vampire, where Charlotte is repeatedly being pursued by a man who sneaks into a room and rips her nightgown and follows her around and harasses her boyfriend, and this is specifically eroticized. The second part that is impacting the film is the boom of direct-to-video releases. Now, I watched a documentary called We Kill for Love that did a massive, comprehensive history of the straight-to-video erotic thriller, and it's a really good resource and I recommend you watch it. I also found this article written by Daniel Robson titled Short Guide to the Direct-to-Video Industry, and this is what it says. D2V titles in the 1990s became synonymous with the NC-17 classification, developed to pigeonhole the increasing quantity of risque features. Films with an NC-17 rating were avoided by cinema exhibitors and quickly became a top-selling, top-shelf temptation. We have this genre that exists exclusively to be watched in your living room, in your bedroom, where you pop the video in and you sit down to watch it by yourself, remote in hand, on the mute button, on the power button, to make sure that if for any reason someone walks in, they will not see you watching something a little bit sexy. Because of this whole rating systems thing, it becomes easier to sneak porn adjacent material into quote-unquote traditional movies. The third aspect impacting this movie, for obvious reasons, is the vampire craze. As the title of this next article that I'm going to reference states, when have we not been in the midst of a vampire craze? So according to this article written by Christopher Beam and Chris Wilson for Slate, two works jolted the vampire world out of its Reagan-era funk: Anne Rice's The Vampire Lestat in 1985 and Joel Schumacher's The Lost Boys in 1987. The former bridged the 18-year gap between the book and movie versions of Interview with the Vampire, while Schumacher's film helped establish the teen vamp genre that would make Buffy possible. We have a ton of vampire movies being made. The title of this movie, Embrace of the Vampire, feels eerily close to Interview with the Vampire, and when they're on the shelves next to each other, you might accidentally just pick up that one because it looks compelling, and you watched Interview with a Vampire the other week and you like that, so you might just pick up one that also has a vampire in it. And so the craze continues. But like I said, when have we not been going through a vampire phase? The fourth aspect impacting this film is the appropriated aesthetics of softcore pornography into quote-unquote mainstream movies. I think a lot of the films in the genre of the straight-to-video erotic thriller would be considered B-movie aesthetics, cheap, trashy, easy to produce, and not meant to linger more than the end of the movie. In his book, Soft in the Middle, the contemporary softcore feature in its contexts, David Andrews says this: the softcore feature stresses extensive female nudity and heterosexual encounters with bumping and grinding. The genre also leans on standardized forms of pornographic spectacle, such as striptease numbers, tub or shower sequences, modeling scenes, voyeur numbers, girl-girl segments, threesomes, orgies, and the like. Since sexual darkness is a generic necessity, without it, an erotic thriller would scarcely be recognized as such. Sex must be poisoned somehow. The softcore thriller has maintained a jaundiced view of male sexuality as a subordinate yet critical element of its feminized pornographic scheme. The softcore thriller's consumerist thrust is moderated by its gender specificity, which has liberal and illiberal corollaries. So we have this kind of in-between, straight-up hardcore pornography and a genre film that emphasizes repeated viewing of different sex scenes and a kind of dark and twisted view on sexuality and how that is going to affect the way that you view the world. With all of these 4 aspects in mind, how does the erotic horror function to play with the idea of fantasy versus reality, and how much is it living up to its lowbrow origins? One of the first things that you will see in this movie is that there is a tagline, and it's not on the poster, and it's not written anywhere on IMDb or Letterboxd. The tagline is that this is under the Nosferatu Diaries, and then there's a colon. It says Embrace of the Vampire. And I think it's very weird because I genuinely forgot that that was the case, but it was something that I made note of when I watched it for the first time this year, because to a certain extent it is evoking something kind of literary. At the same time, it is signalling that this exists as part of a greater body of work, and that this version is going to be like a trashy pastiche of something that already exists, which is very much the mode of these kinds of movies, where they attach themselves to existing titles so that people will be drawn in to watch them. I said that one of the more interesting parts of this movie is how it plays with the idea of fantasy versus reality. The opening scene involves our vampire, played by Martin Kemp, in this softly lit and dreamy environment, remembering his long-lost love with whom he was separated from by a group of vampires who descended on him and ruined his life, and his death also. You have like white horses and streams. There's a literal bodice on this woman. It's very chaste kissing. There's petals, there's a billowing open shirt. It is reminiscent, like a romance novel with one of those like painterly covers. He refers to her as his virgin. It sets up this idea of what his ideal love would be. It would be this innocence that would cure him of his pessimism and his suicidality, kind of. But this fantasy very suddenly becomes marred by darkness and smoke, as I said, he was descended on by 3 mostly naked female vampires who bite him all over, and he is left screaming in agony. And then we merge to the present, where he is luring Charlotte from her room. He is going to attempt to recreate this idealized virgin from his memory by forcing this woman who does not know him to love him. There is this idea that he is projecting onto Charlotte that sex and desire corrupt love, and therefore they must be abstained from. At the same time, he represents a deep temptation. He literally represents the temptation to have sex without love. That's the dichotomy in this movie. You can't return to innocence once the fantasy has been shattered. In an interview with Linda Ruth Williams, who will come up again, don't worry, we love Linda Ruth Williams, Angus had said that she was aware that doing this kind of movie, that there was a certain amount of sex that needed to be included. Otherwise, you have not done your job, and the people who are going to distribute your film want a certain amount of sex. I think it is really interesting that in order to eroticize something, you have to show it in an unobtainable way. And because this exists in a horror thriller area, it also has to be kind of a force for corruption, where sex becomes something otherworldly, but also around every corner and ready to jump on you and tempt you away from the good and proper life. It is always interesting where in trying to make something horny, I guess, you also have to position it as kind of terrible and bad and something that will ruin you. That's kind of the tension of these kinds of movies. For Charlotte, it's not all terrible, and it's not all she's being manipulated away from what she should want. What this film seems to argue actually is that there's a lot about her own life that she'd like to assert for herself. An example of this is that she goes to a party with her friend Nicole. She is immediately uncomfortable and doesn't really want to be there. She didn't want to go in the first place. So the vampire lures her away with his magical voice and leads her to the roof, where she has an uncomfortable scene with him. Now, it's this tension of, as the female character in the movie, what amount of agency do you have over your own world? Is the vampire simply a version of you who does the things that you would never want or never say you wanted out loud, but ultimately leads you to a place where you're more fully realized and more able to assert yourself? I think that is kind of the tension of a consensual non-consent scenario where, yes, she is being stalked by a vampire, but also she's being put in a position where she has to confront her attitudes towards sexuality and the extent that she is holding on to shame and being put in situations that she doesn't want to be in. So like, it's kind of a trope in these movies, for some reason in vampire movies quite a bit, where the vampire in question will save the character from being sexually assaulted. That is the case in this movie as well. On the one hand, you could argue that this man has to come into her life and save her from the world that is oh so scary. What I would argue that is a more interesting way to position this film is that there are certain parts of the world that young women struggle to navigate through simply because they're not taken very seriously. And I think it's kind of shown in the movie that pursuing a sexual fantasy is not always easy. It comes with like double standards and sexual pressure that can just make wanting to pursue it at all seem exhausting and outwardly dangerous. When you have all of this danger and aggression and action funneled into one character, then the main character gets to obfuscate these desires to an entirely different entity so that she doesn't have to experience shame around them. At the same time, fantasy can be used to cloak queerness into something more acceptable. I think one of the more interesting scenes, and I might talk about it later as well in more detail, is the scene where Chris, who is Charlotte's boyfriend, is very drunk at a bar and he's being seduced by Marika, played by Jennifer Tilly. It's kind of an uncomfortable scene because Marika's very aggressive and doesn't really respect Chris's boundaries. She pressures him quite a bit. She becomes like the inverse of him, like a concentrated entity of sexual pressure that forces him to kind of see what Charlotte's been going through with regards to their sexual relationship, which is non-existent throughout the film. But Marika's a vampire the whole time, and unlike the imagined version of this sexual fantasy that belongs to Charlotte, because she sees this happening in her dreams and becomes really jealous about it, Chris is put in a very passive role where he feels preyed upon. But the moment that Chris rejects Marika, Marika turns into Martin Kemp. How do we interpret this? I would say that the queerness in this film is very subdued. Probably the least interesting part of the movie, which is going to sound odd because I literally picked it to discuss here on a queer podcast. When it does turn up, it is incredibly interesting. Like this scene, it works twofold, right? It shows Chris that there is an aggressive sexuality that he's expecting from Charlotte that maybe exists, but the route that he's been going about to encounter it has only pushed her further into her shell. So when he encounters this aggressive sexuality in Marika, he is horrified to learn that maybe what he's after is not the woman that he's actually in love with, but possibly another man who would maybe match his sexuality as he experiences it. At the same time, this realization horrifies him because he's a heterosexual man. What's happening in the world? And me experiencing gay thoughts? Never. You know, it's like that meme. Men will say that they're experiencing demons and the demons are bisexuality. The idea that you could potentially be attracted to a man as a man, it's a genuine horror to Chris. He reacts in fear and runs away. If I was being very cynical, I could potentially interpret this as kind of transphobic because Marika was secretly Martin Kemp the whole time. What? It's not that interpretation isn't valid. I also don't think it's like lingered on long enough for it to be outwardly offensive. It mostly exists to position the vampire as someone who is not a real person but exists to mold himself towards any fantasy of those around him. And that really is kind of like the sinister / tragic part of this, is that in submerging yourself into fantasy and disconnecting from reality, you distance yourself from any genuine connection that you could end up having with other people. He is an undead man who's been living for a long time, who is clinging to this idea of chaste womanhood that simply does not exist, at least not in the iteration that he imagines it. And protecting Charlotte from being corrupted by her own sexuality only really forces her away from him. The closest he ends up to intimacy is him licking a door. This is a real scene from the movie where Martin Kemp licks a door. Now, it is a very funny scene, but putting on my film hat, I also feel as though it does kind of function as simulated cunnilingus and is genuinely the closest sexual contact that he ends up having with Charlotte. He is not able to transcend into humanity because he has this version of people in his head that simply does not exist.
Tell me something. Why can't two people who care about each other so much and love each other so much express it?
We express it all the time, Chris.
Help me with my cross.
You know what I mean?
I never actually said that I intended to wait until I was married, you know.
You didn't.
No. I said that I would make love to the right man when he came along and I was old enough to know.
And I'm not the right man?
I think you are.
You think I am? We've been together a year and about 2 months, and you think I am?
In the vampire film, we can read the vampire as an extension of humanity. So they usually become like the mirror image of one of the characters in the film. The vampire in this film can be read as both Charlotte's and Chris's mirror, their desires kind of converging in a way that they don't really in their actual relationship. So it becomes like this obsessive, prodding, constant force where what they've repressed about what they expect from one another has been concentrated into one entity. It's not abnormal for the vampire in a book or a movie or a TV show to represent pure, unfiltered desire. So I'm just going to read a quote from Nancy Dougherty, who wrote in Vampires, Eroticism and the Law of the Unconscious that the image of the vampire and its victim, as it appears in the psyche of American culture, leads us to flesh and blood considerations. The psyche and the body are of one piece, and while symbolic vampire motifs arise from the psyche, the human conundrum of sex and violence arises from the body and the somatic unconscious. What I love about vampires is not just how they tend to bring out the specific sexual desires of the characters in the movie, but that they have to inhabit a very flesh and blood type ritual of physical expression. Like, it has to manifest as the act of being bitten or biting someone. It has to express itself in the body. It's different from like a ghost haunting you, where the lack of corporeality is the point. It like hovers about you and haunts you through recurrence. The vampire is different in that it is specifically existing to try and eat you. And every good vampire narrative deals with religion. Vampires are creatures that you can't really have without some kind of religion. In American cinema, they revolve around Christianity and the cross and being defeated by holy water, stake through the heart, removal of the head, normal Christian stuff. This is expressed in the film specifically because the main character was raised Catholic went to school and was taught by nuns a specific kind of education. And whilst this movie isn't as bloody, deliberately so, it's a sexy movie. So the lack of like blood and gore and stuff like that, a lot of it is just kind of like Martin Kemp hovering his mouth around Alyssa Milano's neck and chest. The idea that he could bite her but isn't going to. But specifically, Catholic guilt haunts this movie. You can say what you want about the writing. I would say that the most subtle part is the kind of internal struggle that Charlotte has with her faith. It manifests in more obvious ways, where early on in the film, she loses the cross that her boyfriend gave her, and it is replaced with a fertility talisman, which I've watched this film 3 times and I still don't know what the name of it actually is. They definitely say it in the movie, but I can never catch it. It's specifically a sex-related talisman. We're not dealing with subtlety here. But what I will say is that the way that this film presents like shame and guilt is really interesting, where most of the sexual activity happens in Charlotte's mind or in the minds of whoever's thinking about it. There's very little actual sex in the real world of the film. A lot of it is happening either in dream states or as fantasies or as waking nightmares. And I think this kind of speaks to this idea of being constantly haunted by the concept of sin and the idea that you must deal with the quote-unquote bad things about you by repenting and abstaining from pleasure. I don't know that much about being a Catholic. Everything that I have learnt about being a Catholic has come from Catholics who are no longer Catholic and feel very liberated by the idea that they no longer have to be Catholic. So I did some research. I found an article by Jonathan Stotts, which is titled Obedience as Belonging, Catholic Guilt and Frequent Confession in America. And I just wanted to read this to you because I thought it would be relevant. The content of Catholic moral codes tends to focus predominantly on the dangers of the misuse of human sexual faculties. While priests and bishops recognize that marital sex is good insofar that it was the means by which humanity participated in God's creation of new humans, the pleasure involved in procreation was viewed largely as a danger to the Christian moral life. Consecrated celibacy was recognized to be the purest state attainable in this life, and the closer that laity could approximate this ideal, the more holy they may become. Ideas about who should be having sex and when should they be having sex, they come from this idea of like control, and that having a body is about serving a higher purpose until you can get to heaven, where you will no longer have a body, you will just be a soul and you'll be with God forever, and that'll be chill and cool. So until then, you need to be protecting your body, and if you are having dirty sex, then that's not protecting your body. That makes you filled with sin, and you need to repent for that sin and then never have sex again, which seems like a cool, fun way to live. Definitely conducive with the modern world. What I will say is that it is interesting to have the vampire, who is essentially like an ancient being, exist before the modern world, be the character that is jumping into Charlotte's life and being like, you want to be in love with me, you want to have lots of sex, and you want me to bite you so that we can be together forever. It's like this perverse extreme monogamy where you are bonded to this one creature for the rest of time, and in doing so you like relinquish your soul to a higher power in the same way that you would God. At the same time, he represents like all of your sexual compulsions and becomes a way of expressing those, with the catch being that you must completely devote yourself to this being and never ever stray from him and live in the shadows forever and feed off other people who are also going through the same struggle that you are. In a lot of ways, I think a lot of American movies are very Christian movies. I think you get this kind of struggle between like a higher power and having a silly, meaty, flesh-like human body and all of the terrible, awful desires that come with that, and trying to strive towards being a better person by relinquishing yourself to something more powerful than you. I think a lot of movies are about that kind of struggle. The vampire being like a concentrated version of intense monogamy also kind of makes him the ultimate reason why long-term monogamy won't work. The vampire has a lot of hubris in this movie, a word that I love to use, where he kind of exists to expose the ways that Charlotte and Chris are not faithful to each other in their hearts, right? Because they both experience sexual attraction to other people. In doing this, he is also exposing the ways that Charlotte could never ever be devoted to him. He creates these specific elaborate fantasies where Charlotte sees a dream or a vision of Chris cheating on her with Jennifer Tilly, and she's like horrified by this. And at the same time, later in the movie, Chris sees a vision of Charlotte cheating on him with the vampire, and they both realize the ways that their relationship, having been confined to each other, has its pitfalls, has its flaws, has its jealousies and its paranoia, in an attempt to drive them apart and drive Charlotte into wanting to be a vampire. Unfortunately, all this really does is makes her absolutely terrified of ever wanting to be devoted to one person, and it kind of fragments her desire in a sense. This kind of manifests in an orgy scene. Love an orgy. This is a very lovely orgy. It's got like candles and everyone's in leather. There's a lot of dancing involved, there's straddling, there's grinding and stuff. It's a very dry, fairly chaste orgy, if we're being honest. It's this sense that Charlotte can't devote herself to Chris and she can't devote herself to the vampire, so her sexual desires have kind of involved every single person she's ever met, including the people she doesn't like very much, including her dead friend. It's this idea that everyone is having sex, so why not imagine yourself being involved with them at the same time. She's confused and kind of disturbed by this, but not really until she notices that the vampire is also there. He's like biting people, and that's not good. It portrays desire as like something that expands rather than shrinks, and especially as like a character who is going to be an adult, going into the adult world. It's this idea that you don't need to behave as though being attracted to one person for your entire life is normal or even very common, and representing that with a literal orgy. Let's get a little bit meta. Let's pull out a little bit. Let's talk about how the representation of sex itself becomes its own kind of disturbing expression of the unconscious for the audience. So if we think about how in the film Charlotte is stalked and overwhelmed by this desire that is represented as an adult man who is luring her away from her bed at night, where she is found by her boyfriend passed out on the steps, where he is breaking into her room and ripping open her nightgown and kissing her all over. Let's talk about what the audience might get from an experience like this, because here's what you need to know about me when I was researching this. I found it really frustrating to read reviews of this movie, mainly because I liked it and I don't feel like people gave it a fair chance, and a lot of the people who did like it had to caveat it by being like, well, I know it's silly and it's basically just a lot of sex, as if that isn't like the entire point of this kind of genre. Almost every single review that I looked for would bring up Alyssa Milano's body. Mostly the fact that she was naked and how her being naked was a formative experience for the people watching it when they were teenagers, maybe. And it started to annoy me I think. But then I started to think about why stuff like this exists. I already talked about before the facets of the softcore genre of the direct-to-video erotic thriller, and how there is a certain quota, there's certain expectations when people buy or rent stuff like this. They expect to see certain things. It exists to titillate, and it exists to take what is a familiar setting and insert sex into it. So the idea that someone would enjoy the prospect of a vampire breaking into your room and fondling you a bit whilst you were under his spell, what specifically would be enjoyable about that? I mean, it seems obvious to me, but let's explore it a little bit. So we talked about the bodice ripper earlier, but let's bring it back. The idea of like the unconscious desire acting upon you is one thing. It's another thing to be like, I want someone to pull my repressed desires out of me so that I don't have to articulate them. Because I think a lot of this film revolves around sexual pressure and the main character feeling as though she is behind in comparison to her friends, she is disappointing her boyfriend, and that she isn't even really sure what sex should be for her, what she should want from the experience, and how to even approach it when she has this idea of sin hovering over her head. As the audience, we are also watching movies in a world where talking about sex candidly and explicitly is still really, really frowned upon. I mean, it definitely is in Britain, and America honestly seems worse a lot of the time, but who can be sure? We go to movies to, I guess, see our desires expressed in their most honest sense. And let's be honest, some people are just horny, and that's okay. You can put this on, be turned on by it, and then, go on with the rest of your day. The main character being disturbed by her sexual desires only really adds to that experience because it gives the audience something to identify with when they are maybe also shocked or disturbed by their desire for something maybe non-consensual to happen to them, or even just like wanting to have sex before marriage, wanting to have sex with someone other than your romantic partner. This kind of movie offers that to people. Now, I'm gonna finally quote Linda Ruth Williams, who is a champion and a baller, and we love her. So she appeared in the documentary We Kill for Love that I mentioned earlier. She also wrote a really, really, really good book called The Erotic Thriller in Contemporary Culture, and it's excellent, and I wanted to quote from it more, but I couldn't find places to put it, so I'm just gonna read this quote for you now. The genre, the erotic thriller, requires the privacy of the living room and the control of the remote to do its job best, and cuts its cloth to the constraints of televisual dimensions and the power over time and image offered by the VCR handset. At its most explicit, the erotic thriller is unashamedly response-provoking, and is thus subject to all the scorn poured on by both trash culture and masturbation itself. And that is one of the many quotes from Linda Ruth Williams that is excellent. But I think that's why I've been kind of annoyed / frustrated at the response to this film and films like it, where the response is maybe only talking about the amount of nudity, how there's too much nudity, how there's too much sex. I think people struggle to find the purpose or to validate the purpose of stuff that exists to arouse its audience. That maybe I was also kind of guilty of this, only because I don't like when actresses are reduced to their bodies, and I don't like reading objectifying things about people who have given really interesting performances, which I really like Alyssa Milano's performance in this. I think she has really beautiful teeth. Nobody mentions this. I wonder why. Maybe I'm a little bit in the wrong there, in that a lot of this film is built around the amount of sex and nudity, isn't it? It would feel odd if nobody mentioned the sex and nudity, even if I don't think that it's the only thing people should discuss when discussing it. The idea that both the audience and Charlotte are being haunted by this unrestrained attitude towards sex is both incredibly interesting and also kind of sad, because I think I wrote in a review like a couple of weeks ago when I rewatched this that the most outrageous desire that Charlotte is experiencing is the desire to have normative, consensual sex with her heterosexual boyfriend on her birthday and how much anguish this causes her. It's kind of upsetting to think about. I'm going to end this section with a quote from Hayley Phelan, who wrote a piece on why we need erotica. In examining bonds of patriarchal oppression, including those internalized by women, and playing out fantasies of male domination, these forms of erotica offer a fuller, more nuanced understanding of female identity and sexuality. For me, that is genuinely all I can ask of a trashy little movie like this.
Well, I thought we had this plan.
I know, but I really need to study.
Charlotte, it's your birthday tomorrow.
I'll be over tomorrow. I promise.
Well, I wanted to be the first one to wish you a happy birthday and wake up next to you, stuff we planned that. Is it this sex thing? Am I pushing it too hard? Because it doesn't matter. I'm joking most of the time, okay? I want to be with you, wherever or whenever.
It's not that, Chris.
Look, I'll come over right now. I'll sleep on your floor tonight. I won't touch you.
I really need to study alone tonight, Chris.
This last section is, the reason that I make this podcast, to talk about the representation of queerness on screen. And so far, I've mostly spoken about histrionic heterosexuality magnified to such an extent that it becomes terrifying to even want something normative. Where this kind of clashes with the erotic horror/thriller genre is the way that queerness is marginally accepted if it can be aestheticized and sexualized, in the sense that the girl-on-girl scene recurs throughout the genre. It is essentially a staple to the audience watching it, which I think is mostly assumed to be male, but on occasion I think there is this idea that a couple is watching it together. Two women being together is positioned as inherently non-threatening, both to the woman exploring it and to the man watching it, where he doesn't ever have to be usurped. I think it is interesting to include a queer element in this movie in particular because, like I said, this entire movie is about a woman being stalked by a male vampire, and that also seems to be a part of the experience. I do think it's interesting to, envision what the men at home are thinking when watching this. And there have been lots of theories to the extent that men are able to identify with women in horror, whether they are watching to witness a woman being terrorized and suffer at the hands of men, or whether it is a desire to witness something masochistic, and the most comfortable analog would be a young woman, because societally we are more comfortable with watching women suffer. I don't really have to explain that to you, I don't think. I think misogyny proliferates, it persists. The extent that sexuality that doesn't involve a man at all is empowering in this genre, I guess, is hard to parse. Because on the one hand, I am horny. I like watching women fuck each other. I like watching hot people have sex. As long as a sex scene is interesting and tasteful and prioritizes pleasure over the machinations of the body, I'm not incredibly interested in the objectification of people so much as the insistence that the human body is fleshy and tactile and experiencing sensations, and that the camera is replicating that to the best of its ability. It's a visual medium. Objectification kind of goes with it. And on the other hand, being like, to what extent is this simply neutering the very real, sweaty, hairy reality of dyke sex? And can a film like this ever really represent it? Is the like very gentle grazing of another woman's thigh enough? Generally, the answer is no. But at the same time, I'm not going to be offended by two women gently kissing each other. Like, it's literally... It's literally fine. I guess I struggle to be offended by something that exists to titillate me, especially when it kind of does. What I'm trying to work through is the extent that our main character can be considered queer. I think the extent that she is having to painfully reflect on her own sexuality, that's quite a queer experience. I'm sure a lot of LGBT people have had to go through a lot of pain in order to be like, oh, the way that I want to be is okay. What I liked about this film is the extent that Sarah as a character is not antagonistic, but she is an alternate force through which Charlotte is made to see the way that she can't express herself. Their scene together is they meet in the park, they have a light conversation. Charlotte goes back to her room. Sarah starts taking pictures of her. She very gently pushes her to remove more of her clothing because she's that kind of photographer. We'll get to that in a second. And when they start to kiss and touch each other, Charlotte pulls away and leaves the room, and that's the end of the scene. The character of Sarah, I guess, exists as another version of Charlotte who is comfortable with her sexuality, who has a relatively fluid sexuality. She has like a different model in there every night, but is also someone who, to a certain extent, and this isn't really asserted in the film, but this is my analysis, kind of exploits her power over the people she's photographing and puts them in compromising positions that they maybe wouldn't have chosen to do, but end up getting a lot of pleasure from doing it. The film, in the positive column, doesn't present these scenarios as non-consensual. The people who leave her room look very happy. They look happy in the picture. Is it a mistake that the film didn't take a moralistic point of view and be like, maybe she's being a bit exploitative here? I suppose she more exists as a gentler form of the kind of aggressive sexuality that the vampire is imposing on her, where, like we discussed earlier, the non-consensual fantasy provides a character, provides a person with the avenue to explore an aspect of themselves with enough plausible deniability that they can be like, well, it wasn't something I actually wanted, which is pretty much what the whole film is, right? This scenario where Charlotte is in a place where she doesn't feel as connected to her boyfriend, is being like haunted by these visions of sexuality, is having sexuality imposed upon her, and is put in a situation where she is made to reveal more of herself to the camera than maybe she would have wanted. It does have like a weird parallel to real life where Alyssa Milano is entrusting Anne Gossard, a female director, to use her nudity in a way that is interesting and erotic at the same time, and also, I guess, respect her personhood. We can see how the story exists to put this character in this situation in the first place, and then allows her to assert herself and be like, actually, this isn't something that I want. And it's not until later when she's more like vampy. She has like a red dress and she has like dark lipstick and a cigarette, where she flips the script and goes to seduce Sarah in her room. And I think it's interesting that it goes from Charlotte being seduced by Sarah, later in the film, Sarah apologizing for being like kind of too aggressive about the whole situation, and then Charlotte seducing Sarah and kind of stating that Charlotte seems like more of a woman now, that she's gone through this transformation where she feels more in control of her sexuality. I personally love that journey. I think that's cool. I also am aware that the whole like college environment where you're in the dorms and closer to other people your age, and also the kind of stereotype of women having a lesbian experience in college, how these are all informing the experience of someone who has maybe never had the opportunity to explore herself in this way. Queerness as an experience that is liberating, but also is potentially, at least in the eyes of the film, a step towards a more normative modern heterosexuality, where of course you are attracted to other people and potentially to other genders, but you will return to your boyfriend at the end of it. This journey is incredibly different to the experience that Chris has, because he has his own queer experience and it's very brief, and I did discuss it earlier. There is a scene before that, before he meets Marika, who turns out to be the male vampire, where Chris goes to a bar to study. I've never seen anyone do that, but he does do that. And he ends up sitting next to the vampire doing a terrible American accent. And it plays like a scene where the vampire is trying to pick him up. And he states how good looking he is. And Chris has to specifically say that he's not gay, that he's not attracted to men. And you know, it's bleak, but it spells it out quite clearly that the queer experience as a liberating one for straight women, but a imposing and frightening experience for straight men, how this spectrum of sexuality does not really exist the same in a split gender dynamic, that men cannot go around kissing other men and being like, sick, I'm probably going to go home to my girlfriend now, even though that absolutely does happen without a doubt. It's just that it's not really as celebrated or fetishized, is not seen as like a step in the straightness spectrum. In fact, I think a lot of the time it goes the other way, where if you are a quote-unquote straight man who has a gay experience, that is seen as a step towards gayness, not as like being bisexual. And I think that's really the crux of the film, which is to what extent does true bisexuality exist within a male-female dynamic? My hope is at the end of the film, once the credits have rolled, that these two characters feel less pressure to have all of their desires be fulfilled by the other person, when that pressure is clearly what is driving them apart in the film. I mean, we can never know. I think, like, to me, the orgy scene is the most queer and the most liberatory part of the film. Unfortunately, it is presented as something quite terrifying for the main character, and I worry that my interpretation as something that, well, like, fluidity about one's sexuality is cool and should be expected instead of like treated with a level of mistrust. I don't feel as though that's what the film is actually going for. Does this film look like a badger? It's a complicated question, because I know for a fact that people who have watched this did generally not like it. However, the more that I've watched this and watched other direct-to-video erotic thrillers, including the others that Angothard made in her very short directing career, the more fond I feel towards them and the others in the genre. Please don't mistake my desire to see sex and fluid sexuality depicted in an interesting way for a desire to see a return of the conservative sexual politics which weaved their way through the erotic thriller genre. This is ultimately a film about shame and the shattering of fantasy with reality, and its queerness as a result becomes more of a footnote or a stepping stone in this film, though I personally would argue that Sarah comes off a lot better than Chris, for me at least. Now, hopefully, this episode is going to come out on Halloween, so I'm going to give you some scary / disturbing / sexy movies to watch this Halloween that deal with similar themes and are of a similar genre. Now, the first recommendation is Teeth. Yes, it is the Vagina with Teeth movie. When this movie was originally sold to me, I think a lot of people dismissed it as kind of silly. I remember it being like presented as a joke. This movie for me was incredibly affecting, especially about bodily autonomy and the reason why women may choose celibacy or abstinence when presented with situations where sex does not feel like a safe place to explore one's identity. It's also a lot of fun. It is upsetting, definitely upsetting. If you are sensitive to scenes of sexual violence, then I would mind yourself if you're going to check this one out. The second recommendation is a film also directed by Angossard, and it is Poison Ivy 2. Now you might be like, do I need to watch Poison Ivy 1? Not necessarily. All you need to know is that both films deal with age gaps to some extent. I would argue that this film is a lot stronger than the first one, simply because it deals with the idea that women have to put on an identity in order to have a sex life. And it deals with the dangers of sexual freedom and how the pressure to conform to a certain identity ends up splintering it. It also stars Alyssa Milano. So if that was the part of this film that you really liked, then you might also enjoy this one. I'm also going to recommend Flesh Tone, and the reason that I watched this was because it starred Martin Kemp and I was incredibly curious. Am I of the opinion that Martin Kemp is a good actor? No. But this film is fascinating because it felt like what Lost Highway was riffing on. Like, it's Lost Highway, but deadly serious. It's about a man who becomes obsessed with a woman that he meets over the phone, and he ends up being drawn into her dangerous world and becoming obsessed with the idea that she is lying about who she is. The thing about erotic thrillers is that you really have to get on board, and there's a lot about this movie that's very silly. However, I also think that it had a lot to say about the way men view women, as a lot of these movies will end up doing. This last recommendation is probably one of the most famous horror movies of all time, and probably something that you should have watched already if you haven't. But I did watch this in preparation, and it has ended up being one of my favourite horror movies of all time. And that movie is the 1922 movie Nosferatu, simply because it is absolutely fascinating the choices that had to be made when adapting Dracula, and the filmmaking choices that had to be made when you are limited in your resources, but also trying to create an atmosphere of like fear and paranoia, and you have to use lighting and staging and specific animation effects. If you've watched any adaptation of Dracula, then you will know the story, and I need you to not be put off by the fact that it's a silent movie, because it's genuinely one of the greatest movies I've ever seen and very engaging. This one, you have to make it a priority. Thank you very much for listening. That's the end of this episode now. I'm off, and I'm not going to be back until December. I'm skipping the bonus episode for November like I did last year, because the lead up to Christmas and the New Year's is very hectic, and I want to focus my entire energy on finishing up the last episode of this podcast and preparing for next year. If you would like to stay updated, please make sure to follow me on Twitter at LikeABadgerPod. Follow me on Spotify, YouTube and TikTok for full episodes and teasers. If you would like to read some of my writing, you can visit ambercomwalk.com. As I stated at the beginning, I have a new poetry collection that you can purchase now. It's called My Mother Called Me a Hermit, and it's great. You should read it. I also should have, by the time this comes out, published my analysis of the canyons, which feels like I've been working on for 17 months, but it's finally done now, and I am incredibly proud of it. I think it's some of my best writing, so I'll leave a link to that in the description. All my sources are also in the description. I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!